Debate. The honourable member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise this evening to provide a speech in the House for the first time since March. It, however, is disappointing of the circumstances, namely that the debate is motion 1, which has been accurately characterized as a guillotine motion. The motion would provide a mere 4.5 hours of debate in respect of a comprehensive, complex piece of legislation that is not only complex, that has many moving parts, but also comes with it a very large price tag. When one looks at the 3 new temporary COVID benefits, the cost is somewhere in the range of $40 billion. In addition to that, there is a myriad of additional spending amounting to approximately an additional $17 billion. So what we have is 4.5 hours of debate in respect of legislation that has a price tag of nearly $60 billion. Let me repeat that again, $60 billion. Now, to put that in some context, one need only go back 5 years ago to 2015. In 2015, total federal spending amounted to approximately $250 billion. Now, within the span of 4.5 hours, this government seeks to ram through a piece of legislation that equals approximately 1/4 of total federal government spending a mere 5 years ago. Mr. Speaker, one would think that in the face of such a consequential piece of legislation, that the government would welcome input, would provide an opportunity for vigorous and thorough debate in this place. And in order to carry on the debate, I should note that I'm splitting my time with the honourable member for Prince George, Peace River, and Northern Rockies. One would think that that would have been the case. But instead, what we have is a motion that shuts down debate, shuts down scrutiny, shuts down the ability of all members of Parliament collectively to do our jobs, and turns Parliament into nothing more than a rubber stamp. Now, members of the government opposite have said, we had no choice. Our arms were tied behind our back. We're governing, as the Prime Minister so famously said, from the heart out. That we're governing with the best of intentions. That we have to do this. You know, $60 billion of spending in 4.5 hours because we've got to get the money out the door into the pockets of Canadians. Mr. Speaker, I say in response to that, how cynical and how disingenuous it is on the part of those Liberals. It need not have been so. The fact is, Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister knew full well that CERB would expire and other benefits, as they have 2 days ago. Indeed, he set the expiration date. He knew that there was a need to fill the void arising from the expiration of CERB and other programs, he knew that that would have to be legislated upon. What did the Prime Minister do in the face of that? Did the Prime Minister consult the opposition parties? No. Did the Prime Minister engage with parliamentarians? No. Instead, the Prime Minister shut down Parliament. Now, why in the world would the Prime Minister shut down Parliament when all of these substantive matters needed to be addressed that have a profound impact on the livelihoods of millions of Canadians? Well, Mr. Speaker, the answer to that is very simple and deeply troubling. The Prime Minister, you see, was caught in a summer of scandal involving hundreds of millions of dollars that went out the door to the Prime Minister's friends in the WE organization, an organization that had personally enriched his family, an organization that traveled the finance minister and his family around the world and financially benefited the now former finance minister. The government was rocked by hearings in which it became increasingly clear that the Prime Minister had acted corruptly. And just by coincidence, on the eve of 5,000 pages of documents being disclosed in relation to WE, the Prime Minister saw fit to shut Parliament down, to shut down 3 committees, including the committee that I had sat on, the Finance Committee, which was undertaking extensive hearings, which had a lot of questions arising from the 5,000 pages of documents and testimony that we had heard. But obviously, the Prime Minister wanted to change the channel. So here we are. He shut down Parliament to cover up his own corruption, rushes legislation immediately after the speech from the throne, and now says it's a fait accompli if Canadians are going to get benefits that they need in this time of unprecedented crisis, that we're going to have to ram it through in 4.5 hours. Now, we on this side of the House have taken every effort to try to work with the government, even despite the Prime Minister's attempts to shut us down. We tried, when Bill C-2 was introduced, to work over the weekend. But the government rejected our efforts. The government rejected all efforts to provide for an opportunity to call witnesses, to ask questions of ministers, to go through a clause-by-clause process. All of that is gone, Madam Speaker. And I've got to say, it would be troubling if it was just in this one instance. But what we have seen is a troubling pattern on the part of the Prime Minister in terms of shutting down opportunities for accountability and oversight. This is a Prime Minister who brought forward time allocation 63 times in the last Parliament, despite saying in 2015 that his government would never, ever, ever think to bring forward time allocation. This is a Prime Minister who shut down the Justice Committee that I served on in the last Parliament when we were getting to the bottom of the government's corruption in SNC. This is a Prime Minister, but at a time when the government has been spending hundreds of billions of dollars, has seen fit to shut down Parliament through most of the spring, and summer, at a time wherever there was a time for the need for Parliament to be sitting, it surely would be at that time, at a time of this current health and economic crisis, Madam Speaker. And it is ironic, I have to say, that as the government continues to pour out hundreds of billions of dollars with very little oversight, without very little accountability, the government has seen fit to starve the Auditor General from following the money. Madam Speaker, the government has refused to provide the Auditor General with $11 million, hundreds of billions of dollars going out the door, but not $11 million.
We're quite over time. Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Yes. Thank you, Madam Speaker. You know, I've been listening very carefully to the member opposite, and I only wish you would grace me with as much time as would be required in order to refute many of the comments that my friend has put on the record. Having said that, I'm interested in his thoughts in regards to this morning. You see, Madam Speaker, the member, along with others, will say, well, we want more time. We want more time to be able to talk about this very important issue. Yet this morning, what do? Is they moved a report on a concurrence to be able to talk about a former MP, as opposed to talking about no, not the Conservative, but it was a Liberal. But I know what you mean. Absolutely, Madam Speaker. The point is that the Conservative loyal opposition felt it was more important to talk about something outside of the pandemic completely. And I'm wondering how the members opposite can justify having that sort of a debate this morning and then now say, well, now we want more time to talk about this, when they had time this morning.
For St. Albert Edmonton.
Well, Madam Speaker, it's just unbelievable what the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader was saying, but understandable at the same time. I can appreciate that the government is embarrassed by another Liberal who was found to be in contravention of the Conflict of Interest Act, just as the Prime Minister himself has been found guilty not once but twice, the first Prime Minister in Canadian history to be found guilty of breaching the Conflict of Interest Act. The Finance Minister's multiple contraventions of the Conflict of Interest Act. This government is a walking scandal, scandal after scandal after scandal, and I know that he doesn't like to talk about that, but the real issue is 6 wasted weeks and now 4.5 hours to debate $60 billion in spending. That's unacceptable.
Comments, the Honourable Member for New Westminster, Burnaby.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I certainly agree with all of the criticisms of the member towards the Liberal government. And the NDP has been on the record as saying that this was deplorable, how the government handled the last few weeks. But I must say, Madam Speaker, given his words and what he is zeroing in on, I almost think it's a complete repudiation of the Conservative government. He was criticizing the Liberals 63 times, he's quite right to say, imposing closure, imposing time allocation, except that we remember the Harper government over 100 times doing the same thing. Mr. Harper taught the Prime Minister how to disrespect Parliament. And he raises the point of the $60 billion, except the Harper government hit $114 billion in bank bailouts and liquidity supports and never brought it to Parliament. Is this not? And they're asking for forgiveness for everything the Conservatives did when they were in government.
St. Albert Edmonton.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank the member for New Westminster Burnaby, and I can say that I would be proud to stand on the side of the Harper government and its successful record of balanced budgets and economic growth and strong and ethical government compared to this government's record of failure and record of hypocrisy.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Manicouagan. Madam Speaker, I'd like to thank my honourable colleague from St. Albert Edmonton for his speech and ask him, in fact, if he believes that it's going against what voters expect of us when we decide to prorogue a parliament for several weeks.
The honourable member for St. Albert at Edmonton.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to thank the member for Manicouagan. And yes, I would absolutely agree that the voters did not send us here to be prorogued, to be shut down, and then in the middle of the night, indeed in the early morning hours when most Canadians are asleep, to pass a $60 billion bill with virtually no debate.
Resuming debate.